Hi everybody, welcome to episode 19 of Demand Decoded. Thank you for tuning in and taking the time to join us. So today we've got Phil and Amanda, and we're going to be running through some of our B2B marketing predictions for 2024. So quite an exciting episode, I think. How are you both doing?
Good, thanks, Dan.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Cool. So we're going to take some time to basically discuss where we see 2024 going in terms of B2B marketing, looking at how we see buyer behavior evolving, changes to channels, how the advertising game might evolve, the impact of AI, which I know we've heard a lot about, but be interesting to see, where we think that's going in 2024, emerging tech, and also what we think might make a reviving comeback in 2024. So let's dive right in. If you are watching live, feel free to kind of join in the conversation with us and post in the comments section on LinkedIn, and we can have a bit of a dialogue back and forth. So let's dive in and talk a bit about where we see the evolution of buyer behavior and buyer preferences going in 2024. Do you want to kick things off, Amanda?
Sure. I think certainly something that's continuing from this year from our perspective is that different pieces of content, different types of content are appealing to different people, and therefore the kinds of content that are being created, actually the different formats is increasing a lot. There's a lot of diversification. We know that different people have different amounts of time to spend on content, educating themselves within their role. So, shorter form content, things like TikTok might suit salespeople really well, more than something that's maybe longer form. And certainly, I think really seeing more tailoring of this kind of content really resonates with this audience. So we're going to lean into that and work with what we can see there.
Yeah. What about you, Phil? How do you see the evolution going?
So I think that the main ongoing trend we're witnessing and will continue to see develop is one of buyers taking back anonymity, privacy, control, and being aided in that pursuit by governments in some situations and tech platforms. For the most part, I feel like marketing and buyer behavior are in a constant cycle of evolution, one driving the other in terms of what's effective. And we've seen that over many years repeat itself in our inboxes, in our search results, starting to happen today on our social media platform feeds and so on. And so I think there's this continual trend over that period of time towards increased reluctance to share personal details because they know it opens them up to bombardment of communication, some of which is quite unpleasant at times. And I think, the fact that we are all directly reachable on our mobile phone handset, by people who have good intentions and bad intentions, and people who can get into our inbox with good intentions and bad intentions, I think that's driving this sort of increased desire and want to remain anonymous and remain private throughout the purchase decision. And that will drive what marketing is effective, what technology platforms and vendors do in response, what new platforms become available, and so on. And so for the most part, it's that cycle that goes on that continues to drive things. Less frequently, there are, I suppose, what you could call black swan events, large, unpredictable events that shift us one way or the other. COVID was one of those, and that had, impacts that perhaps weren't part of that simple cycle. And AI is another one that perhaps, is in some ways going to just accelerate that cycle, but also has impacts that aren't part of it. But those big impact having changes are not the norm. It's a slow trend for most of us in terms of what buyers respond well to, react well to, and ultimately how they engage with us as they go through their purchase decision.
Yeah, I think going on from that as well, with the, desire to remain anonymous, the desire to keep our inboxes free of, the 20,000 emails we get every day that are just spam, there will actually be more of a desire from buyers to invest potentially in technology that helps them do those things, helps them stay anonymous, helps them keep privacy. and maybe we'll see, some more tools to help that, or at least current platforms putting the options out there.
I think that's a really good point, Dan. I think ultimately, deep down, we all know that there's never been a point in time where people have wanted their information to be held by people they didn't know and that they didn't trust with it, right? We know that desire for privacy and protection of anonymity is something that kind of dates back to the beware of the dog sign and beyond, But now, as people become more aware of how their data is being used than ever before, and they're actually paying more and more attention to that and the way it's being, evolving in legislation and things like that, it's only natural that platforms, different softwares are going to respond and say there's going to be a desire here. And so, to help put those structures in place, the desire is always the same. The behavior is only possible when there are tools to introduce that barrier, that guard dog.
Yeah, that dog barking at the door. So in terms of where we see channels going, so obviously a lot of channels to run through in B2B marketing, but if we cover some of the main ones for B2B specifically, where do we see search going in 2024? Phil, do you want to kick us off?
So I think something that's worth bearing in mind in terms of all channels is that there are curves of adoption. There will always be voices that those of us that are immersed in a subject will see, on social media platforms like LinkedIn, which are really talking about the cutting edge of things. And they might be declaring that a channel is no longer effective, or it's no longer the most effective, or it's even dead. But the reality is that for the majority of businesses, they're probably in the middle mass, right, where there's still a lot of value in quite a lot of channels. And yes, there's shifts and there's changes. So I think, search is still incredibly important and will remain a vital way for businesses to be found by buyers. The role of search in the buying process will be different in different industries, geographies, sectors, and so on. But it isn't going away. It isn't going to die off overnight. Although, if you look at a lot of thought leadership content on LinkedIn, for example, you might be forgiven for thinking so. And there are probably some areas, sectors, which haven't even adopted search as a channel yet. So, there will be some laggards in that regard, less and less every day. But search will stay relevant and will remain. I think it's incredibly, when you think about the world needs a phone book, right, for the web. We need a way to find all the websites that potentially offer the right solution to the problem we have, help us solve our challenges and so on. And search is really, really good at that. It's really, really good at taking an idea that we've formed elsewhere, that we've started to develop an understanding of, and help us take the next step. So as that directory, if you like, of the entire web, it's not going to go anywhere. Yes, it's going to get reassigned by a lot of buyers, I think, some, not all, but a lot, in terms of the role that it plays in their purchase process. We know already that for savvy, forward-thinking individuals and industries, search is no longer the beginning of the journey. It's a midpoint on the journey, them having already identified their problem through passive observation of content on social, conversations within other areas, and then they turn to search to further their research, further their pursuit of the solution. And sometimes it's just to go to the vendor that they already know is top of their list. But that's still a very important step that people need to remain aware of and optimize for, because to let that go, to let that slip, might mean that you're not appearing when they're acting on that very, very high, well-developed intent, and someone else is getting that opportunity to talk to them about a solution.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Amanda?
Yeah, I'd echo Phil. I think where search at the moment has no equal is when it comes to your transactional, I want X item and I want to see who sells it approach. Now that's not always something that's a personal item. That could be, for your office, for your business context. It can be all sorts of things. But ultimately, there is nothing that replicates the ability to see the full marketplace that search provides. Some people opt into narrower marketplaces. They'll go to the likes of Amazon and eBay and so on, but that's still using search functionality. It's just not big search, the way that we think about it in the overarching context. When we talk about the changes that we're going to see, I think there is inevitably going to be some evolution to respond to some of the things that we're seeing elsewhere. We're going to talk about AI, but some search platforms are already adapting and bringing in AI tools to the way that people can search and integrating those. And I think that will become more common, and we'll see that have more and more impact on what we can see. Certainly that those search results pages will change, but at the moment, while people might be calling it dead or saying that volumes are decreasing, there's nothing that replaces that whole view of the market that you can get, I don't think.
Yeah,
no, indeed.
I think your point on search results pages is a really important one, because we're already kind of seeing that start to take place with the introduction of YouTube Shorts and just more and more variety within search results pages, especially towards video. Like video content is coming up more and more. So I think more and more marketers will look to YouTube as a place to kind of aid their search. Yeah, potentially.
There are some challenges facing users of search, I think, because ultimately Google, like everything else that we use to research and discover, is a profit-driven organization, and it does profit-driven things. And search results have evolved lately to being increasingly above the fold populated with paid elements or elements that are not organic search results. Unfortunately, search is not a utility, a publicly owned utility that operates exclusively in its users' interests. But I think Google will always, and others that follow its pattern, will always have to walk a line there, and test and balance, because users still want what they believe to be the deserved organic results to be available to them. All the while, Google is at the moment certainly leading increasingly with paid and sponsored content. So they're going to continue to test and iterate on that layout. And we've seen some very big changes to the SERP results page, content of late. Be interesting to see how that develops. The big risk for any platform, I think, is over optimizing for ad revenue, because that will alienate users. And that may be the thing that gives other platforms, other vendors, an opportunity in what might otherwise seem like a pretty tied up marketplace. There's definitely a perception among buyers that once a platform becomes over optimized for its ad revenue providers, the user's value starts to get eaten away at. And I think that might affect a variety of channels.
Yeah. Okay, so I suppose to summarize search, it's not going anywhere. Search results will probably change and evolve. AI will probably have some impact, potentially a bit more advertising, but it's here to stay.
Yeah.
Social, one that's on the up, would we say, continues to be more prominent in buyer journeys and in more and more industries, I would say. Where do we feel like that's going in 2024? Amanda, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I think obviously we're seeing, as with any channel, and we've already kind of touched on this, any channel becomes saturated, becomes loaded with ads and monetization, and becomes less valuable. That seems to be part of the cycle of the digital era that we kind of live through. So I would expect not that we'll see major changes to the existing social platforms, that we're more likely to see change in the form of new platforms. It certainly feels like there have not been enough big challenges to the big social platforms over the last few years. Certainly in the B2B space, it really doesn't feel like there is anything that matches up to LinkedIn. I can't help but wonder what is going to come along and be the David to that Goliath, as it were. But yeah, I think that change is unlikely to come from within these platforms themselves, because they're making their money. They're doing what they need to do to satisfy their shareholders ultimately.
Yeah, the saying goes that marketers ruin everything. I wonder if AI-powered marketers can ruin it quicker. And I reckon, platforms like LinkedIn, which I, have a lot of respect for, I love LinkedIn. I worry that they're facing a singularity of sorts, because when their algorithms, which are optimized for engagement and ad revenue, meet AI-generated content at scale, like, that's going to be a tricky thing to sort of not chase off a cliff, so to speak. It could really bring algorithms like Google's and LinkedIn's to their knees for a while, unless they get very good at identifying AI generated content or content that doesn't have the requisite value to it. To prevent their feeds becoming just diluted, not interesting to their readers, moving too fast, to be able to create any kind of measurable impact. And I think so for these businesses, this, the rise of AI, which has only risen so far today, but the next year and years looks very interesting. Just in the last few days, I think it is, ChatGPT announced custom GPTs, where you can theoretically build a custom version of GPT-4, train it to do something like write just like you, and then you've got unbridled content creation potential. How does an algorithm-driven platform ensure that its visitors continue to get value when it's facing an onslaught of that kind of content? I think that might be the thing that drives people to other, as Amanda indicated, niche platforms that serve more specific audiences or needs, and by being more decentralized are less prone to attack from auto-generated low value, low quality content. Very hard to know what will happen there, but I think decentralization may start to gather some traction.
I think there's going to be a desire for social to be more social, which is funny, right? Because when it was introduced with the likes of Facebook, and you had all your friends on there and you would communicate and you would talk back and forth, but it's just kind of becoming, or to be honest, has already become a channel to broadcast a message, to broadcast your own opinion rather than have a conversation. And I think there's more and more desire to have those conversations again.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. We're broadcasting on a social channel right now. You see some of the biggest and most viral pieces of social content are like closed environments where the person who spoke first gets to influence and respond and kind of own the conversation if they choose to do so, or unfiltered, comment chaos happens. There is a big difference between broadcast and commentary and then actual social dialogue. I think it's not really the case that the platforms that there's almost a case to say that, social is mislabeled at the moment. It's small form broadcast channels that we kind of live and work in, really. But I agree with you that, I could see a shift to more true social, more interaction, perhaps even back to forum culture, where you're actually going and asking a question to get a conversation going and to see what people think.
I think to some degree, some of these takes are in that sort of leading early adopter area. For most people, next year, social probably represents an opportunity to reach an audience that are more that are not going to use search to initiate their problem identification, solution selection process. There are industries, sectors, groups, regions, geographies, and so on, where search is a very effective way to get in front of the not actively buying audience. And for the majority of businesses, adopting social as one of their channels to power their demand generation is a trend we're going to see next year. So therefore, we will see increased usage, increased spend, no doubt, and growth, both in audience and marketers using the platform. And then I think at the sort of early adopters, where marketers usually are, you're going to start to see some of these potentially challenging issues creep in, where it's overutilized, saturated, mastered, and starts to maybe have questionable value for us.
Yeah, cool. That was well summarized, I think. Email, a very common B2B marketing channel that's been around for ages. How do we feel email is going to change in 2024? I suppose, actually, if you don't mind, I'll kind of kick things off, because recently I posted on LinkedIn about the Gmail update to add more protection against spamming. Will it actually have a huge impact? Probably not, because it's really just relating to the domains that are sending thousands and thousands of emails. But I think there is some movement in the right direction when it comes to email and adding more layers of protection to people's inboxes. But going into next year, I still just feel like email is going to just go into an inbox full of absolute pure chaos, and it's going to be a really hard channel to utilize in order to get any attention, any traction, any engagement, just because it's swamped with so many unsolicited messages that nobody really wants. It's hard to stand out in an inbox.
Absolutely. If I just sit here and think how many more things I've unsubscribed from this year than subscribed to, that tells me a huge amount about the way things are going. We're signing up and we think we're signing up in a safe or closed environment. Most of the case, it clearly isn't, because you're signing up for one thing and you're hearing from 10 different people. That doesn't seem to be reducing in any way. And there are obviously other ways that people can be getting your information to reach out to you and so on still. But yeah, I think email has become the last place I would discover something that I would purchase, unless it is because I have signed up for something that I will continue to look at from time to time, or that has value to me. But I do think that it's hard to actually create enough value for email marketing to generate return.
There is potentially an island of opportunity around this sort of personal brand B2B influencer. That's an opportunity that's coming from people's desire/need to see authenticity in the content they consume. But before we get to that, I think in B2B marketing, the majority of email is unwanted. Even the lead nurturing stuff that marketers convince themselves is highly aligned to the buying journey and deeply valuable to the recipient, most of it is undesirable and ignored. And to that point, I've completely forgotten what I was going to say.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable end of sentence, frankly. Most email is ignored. I
do have one more thing to add there, which is Google's announcement is interesting about punishing or penalizing or I don't know, controlling mass spam senders, because I get a lot of spam from Gmail addresses. So I wonder what they're going to do in relation to, because people spin up Gmail addresses to burn by doing link outreach and so on, because they know they daren't do it on their domain brand, right? So if they could somehow control or curb that, it would be very, very welcome.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be for the next 5 years or so before they get a real grip on it. Even then, I'm not sure, to be honest.
There's always going to be ways around it. That's the problem. Yeah. That's why email is such a flawed channel at the moment.
I remembered my point now.
Yeah.
Sorry, Amanda. So the point being that we talked about it before we came on air, which is that lots of people, lots of businesses still say email is one of the most effective channels, and that's hard for me to rationalize. And one of my conclusions, and I don't know if it's right, is that maybe it's a product of that kind of like reverse engineered attribution lookup approach, which is we got a deal. Let's look at all the marketing things we managed to shove under the nose of this person before they bought, as opposed to being able to say, we sent some really good emails and they produced this opportunity, this pipeline. We know from some really, really smart people who've looked at a lot of data, that they share widely on LinkedIn, that in many cases, attribution is telling you, how effective you were at getting in front of people before they became a customer, not, and it's impossible to know actually, what you did that influenced them along the way. And that may be where a lot of the success of email marketing in B2B is, probably misappropriately identified, perhaps attribution rather than actual, influence.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think as well, there are probably two areas where email is still effective, but they both hinge on value. One is in transactional situations where you have a company you purchase from regularly, you might well stay subscribed to their marketing, waiting for the next voucher code or the next time that you get something that other consumers of that product who aren't subscribed don't get. That's a kind of value that channel can provide. So, in my case, it's this time of year, Black Friday is coming up, and there are the brands that I typically buy from, and I will have a look to see if there are voucher codes and things that make it a better time for me to buy, etc. The other big area, I think, is still the situation where if the value is in the content itself, the information that you're providing, then you're going to have potential for success, true success with email. But I would say that the businesses that are able to do so, content is part of what they sell. They are consultancy, advisory, or they provide education as part of what they do. I class the likes of HubSpot in that, because HubSpot's academy and the knowledge that's available in it is also a piece of value that is created. So being subscribed to emails from an organization that's seen truly as having great insight and education to provide is a fantastic thing. And I would say, HubSpot and the likes of that kind of company lean so much into the content and education that they provide that it's seen as part of their overall value, even if what they're ultimately selling is the software. But it's not something that every kind of company can do. Ultimately, if you make office chairs, you're unlikely to be able to, give informational content. Maybe. See, I'm always going to start thinking about it, but no.
Like the partners of this world, they've got information that has value to distribute, and therefore they've probably got an opportunity. And we talked about, authenticity being really effectively achieved when you've got a personal, thought leader who's putting themselves out there. Those sorts of things can have value. But something that's not changed over the years, particularly, is I've looked at many businesses' email marketing programs, particularly the automated nurturing stuff, and almost without fail, they're unable to identify the positive impact of that, that channel, because the things that they can measure don't line up and say, well, email nurturing, for example, email marketing as a channel is a big producer of closed won opportunities. They almost all come via other journeys. And so we've seen it time and time again. It's like, no matter what people say and no matter what experts tell us about what's effective and what isn't, if it isn't working for you, that's data you can trust. Your own data in terms of where are your opportunities coming from, are workflow goals being met or not, et cetera, trust that stuff, because the gurus are not in ownership of information that's more credible than your own.
Yeah, I think we're going to do an episode soon on why email nurturing doesn't work, actually, and maybe we can bring some of the data and stuff to the front of that to give a bit of evidence as to why you shouldn't do it. So what about new channel? Podcasting. It seems like everybody has a podcast, like right now. It's kind of the cool thing to do. This is a podcast. Been going, like 9-10 months now. Had some success with it, enjoyed it. Do we see podcasting continue to grow? Like, will it evolve? I don't know. What do we think,
It's
Amanda or Phil? You go.
Well, I was going to say it's a good question, because I think we'll almost certainly see more people start, because it's generally accepted that podcasting is being seen as a positive marketing strategy or tactical channel or approach. We'll probably see more people give up, because we also know that it's quite hard to get podcasting working in that directly measurable performance type way, where you get massive audience numbers, and if you're looking at it through that lens, then you may struggle to justify it long term. But, like social, for the most of us, podcasting is a new area of opportunity to reach buyers, particularly in that sort of specific niche sector area way, that's able to that can reach them pre-search. And reaching people pre-search, influencing them pre-search, becoming trusted and even preferred before they turn to search is so valuable these days. But you've probably got to look at podcasting through a broad lens when it comes to measuring its success, if you are going to build the perseverance that's needed to keep it going. And it's widely known that podcasting is hard, or perceived to be hard, and giving up is common. So, but I think people said the same thing about writing blogs back in the day.
Yes, I was going to say that when you were talking about it, I was like, this is what people used to say to us about blogs and the investment of time. Now, obviously, search came along and gave that additional power, and they evolved together, certainly. But I can't help but feel that it's inevitable that the platforms and the other behaviors and other channels will evolve to accommodate. I think that podcasting is an excellent way to get into creating content regularly. It doesn't have to be as difficult as it might seem from the outside. It can be put together in a really accessible way. But the most important thing, the thing that defines its success or failure, isn't how many subscribers you have, how many watches you get, or anything like that. It is on the one hand, if what you're creating is valuable and discoverable by the people who matter most to you, it will have a positive effect on your brand. So where is it? How are you making sure that you're giving as much as you possibly can through it? And then, are you seeing an overall improvement in your performance? And are you seeing anything like self-reported attribution around it? We've talked about this a number of times here, but we get really positive comments when we get inquiries about our podcast. In many environments, that will have a similar effect. And if it doesn't, if you're still looking at an overall uptick, and that what you're producing is of high quality and value and is in the right places, then I can see why people will fall out of love with it or move away from it, because the immediacy of metrics are not where they think they should be. But those metrics are the vanity metrics, actually.
Maybe the trend is going to be one around the medium rather than the channel. So, for example, one of the things that I think is really neat about the way we do it, to pat ourselves on the back a little bit, is the fact that while this produces a podcast as an output, the content is raw human discussion. It's us talking about what we've seen, heard, learned, and done over our careers. And it produces video content that goes live on LinkedIn, as it is right now, video content that's discoverable in YouTube, video content and audio content that can be cut and used within organic and promoted social, and a podcast. But of course, getting listeners to the podcast might be one of the most trailing measurable, impacts of that. Because you're right, Amanda, platforms are not great, I don't think, at surfacing podcasts to new listeners. Unless you're an active searcher for podcasts, I don't think they come. You don't stumble across them all that often. I don't. So maybe it's it's the content and it's the nature of it and it's the medium that's more important. And especially as we see this rise in written content is no longer as trustworthy because it could be AI generated. Whereas when people talk to you, you've got a much better handle on whether you can trust it. Yes, it's possible probably via AI to fake all of this, but for the most part, we're not doing that. And so this is very effective at cutting through noise, creating affinity, creating trust, and getting attention, which we all need. And so maybe it's doing this that's most important, and having podcast as one of your formats for it is a good way to get some evergreen longevity and use out of it.
That point about authenticity, I think, is so important. This is very unvarnished, and that is both, that is part of its virtue. Ultimately, we are just having a conversation about things that we are ultimately quite interested in, and we don't iron out the mistakes from that before people see it and so on. There may come a time where deep fakes are so cheap and easy to create that this can all be replicated, but we know, generally speaking, that we're nowhere near that. None of us Barack Obama or someone that's worth making a deep fake of. So, this is going to be a great way to connect in a way that feels truly human, and like we're having a real conversation with our audience.
Yeah, I do worry that the kind of format of podcasts might need to evolve. I think people are going to get tired of the interview style podcasting that is just kind of everywhere right now. Like, perhaps we'll see the rise of more kind of solo podcasting or discussion panel based things rather than just interviewer, interviewee, diary of a CEO style podcast that everybody kind of seems to do. I think there might need to be some evolution because people will start to get bored of that format.
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. And as someone who listens to a lot of podcasts, Dan, I would trust your take on that.
Well,
yeah,
I think I'd probably critique that because radio's been around for over 100 years, and a lot of that is just conversations between people. Desert Island Discs has been running for a huge amount of time. Actually, I think it's one of those things that is kind of a universal human truth that we love to hear what feels like the unvarnished opinion of other people, when and to digest it and think about it and think about our opinion in response. That kind of sense of like listening to an orator or people having a discussion and debate. People have been doing that since ancient times. We just happen to have a digital channel for it where we can digest, we can choose what the topic is.
Yeah. Perhaps.
Yeah, I think go on, Phil.
Well, I just think that B2B research and buying takes place in certain places more than others. You can't necessarily attribute the longevity of radio to the longevity of the interview style podcast necessarily, but it's a very interesting point, something that has got me thinking.
Interviews have been around for ages. They have been primetime television. They have been, the stalwarts of Radio 4 and all the others.
Yeah. But the one commonality of successful interview style things is the interviewer. Not everybody is cut out to be an interviewer. I am. I'm not. A lot of B2B marketers and B2B people are not cut out to be interviewers, but a successful interview is only as good as the interviewer. So
nice point.
Right, let's move on. I feel like we've spoken about podcasting for ages. It's a great topic. Events. Do we have a take on where we see events going in 2024? Who wants to talk?
I can kick us off with this. I think overall this year, going into next year, I see more and more desire for the reality of human connection in the physical event space. I certainly think that people are more inclined to have in-person meetings again, and certainly seem to be more inclined to go to events that might have just been purely run digitally or relied on hybrid environments over the last few years. I think it certainly feels this year going into next year like people are more inclined to try and get back to normal, pre-pandemic life. obviously lots of people want to keep a lot of the benefits that have come to us and the changes in the ways that we work and things like that. But I think people are enjoying freedom to see people and remembering the benefits of it over digital, essentially.
Yeah, I think there's probably, the trend for a while, or at least the reported trend, has been hybrid events being more and more common and popular. And I think the presumption there is because it facilitates both in-person attendance and virtual attendance. But I bet you actually the people that get the most value out of the recorded content are the people that attended in person, or at least at the time, because we know it's very easy to book a seat, reserve a seat for something, particularly when it's free or low cost, because you feel good, right? You feel like you're taking a step towards a goal. But actually, to your point earlier, Amanda, carving out the time to then concentrate on it is near on impossible if it isn't in person.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there might be a lot more value in events for the organizer and the attendees if there is an in-person element that people are at. And the hybridness is still really, really valuable because you get such a long tail benefit as an attendee and therefore as an organizer from having access to that content after the moment, because most of us can't recall everything that was, told at a 3-day event, for example, or even a half-day event. But universally, I think we can all agree that attendance versus registration for virtual events of any size is always a fraction, a real fraction.
Yes.
And therefore, I reckon the best benefit is going to be got when people combine in-person attendance with the availability of the content afterwards, thanks to the hybrid approach.
I think so too. I think, we all know that it's easier to remember things you were there for than things that you just watched or had reported to you effectively. We all know how easy it is tuning into something like this to have your emails still open and get distracted and not really be in the room. And that difference to your recall, to your actual ability to process what you're hearing and respond to it, and even if it's only within your own mind, you can't really trade on that. I don't think, I think in a way I probably will stop signing up to things I can't attend in person, because I know how much more I would get out of it actually being there and not having any distractions. And I know that if I'm actually at my desk that day, I probably will not carve out the time.
Yeah.
I think events will be more important potentially in B2B marketing, as we kind of suggested the rise of buyer anonymity and privacy and the importance of those things. It might actually start becoming one of the only places that B2B marketers and businesses can reach potential buyers. They are, or at least reach them before they declare their interest for your product, because they're in that room with you. They are there. They are human. You can talk to them. Whereas in a digital environment, they just want to remain anonymous. They want absolutely nothing to do with you. But perhaps, in that kind of networking environment, they'll be open to a conversation.
That's a good point.
Cool. Slightly running out of time, but AI and advertising, I suppose we'll come back to. They are search, they are channels, I suppose, a bit of search in there. But I think we're going to dive into those a bit more broadly. So if we start with advertising and how we see the advertising game and plethora of options evolving in 2024, what do you see that looking like? Do you want to start us off, Amanda?
Yeah, I think the first one for me is kind of an anti-trend, which is when we were talking about this episode, we were thinking about it. The question I asked is, do we think personalization is dead in advertising? Because right now, the disappearance of data, the disappearance of people willing to share information with you has made true personalization almost impossible to do. I would say. I certainly think that if not dead, it's on pause for now, because the information isn't there to facilitate even, sophisticated use of smart content, let's say.
Yeah.
Yeah, third-party cookies being removed, and even though they'll be replaced with cohorts, they're basically going to make personalization, true personalization, as opposed to targeting, much, much harder. That's for sure. I think, as a result of trends that we've already discussed, and naturally there'll be more and more places to advertise, and potentially more and more places that are really interesting to advertise and get traction quite quickly, because they reach an audience more effectively without you having to impinge on their privacy, so to speak. As in, if there are platforms that serve very specific groups of people, then their advertising offering will be very, very attractive and relevant. Whereas others might be, starting to decline in their attractiveness due to ultimately over optimization and over engineering towards ad revenue and ad profit. What else is going to change in the advertising game? I'm not so sure.
I think sorry, go on. You go.
I think with what Phil, you're saying about there being an increase in number of places to advertise. Every time a channel is added, there's another place to advertise. I think we're likely to see an increase in the desire for actually advertising distribution, centralized. Certainly when you're looking across, all of the different channels that are available to you, not everyone is going to have the resource for dedicated teams for each of those channels. And so, aggregated views are going to be valuable. But it's hard to say. Yeah, I think it's hard to say more than that in terms of what changes we might see in advertising.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another tightrope being walked, which is a lot of the time users of advertising platforms are being fed advice which is aligned around in-platform metrics and optimizing those, which doesn't always correlate with in-pipeline metrics and purchases. And I think marketers are going to, we assume, become more and more aware and savvy and learned around what actually drives revenue, because it's becoming increasingly a focus for all teams, I guess, because we're seeing quite, challenging environments in which we're operating. So people are getting more and more scrutiny around what's really working. And so hopefully that will produce more judicious use of advertising, as opposed to this like massive campaign, spray it loud, wide, everywhere, and measure the metrics that tell you the ad's working, although it might not actually be producing anything that is turning into revenue at the end of the day. And that would be a positive thing, because it would mean that the advertising, the room for advertising that we have in our minds and in our world will be more fairly distributed and utilized by people for better results. Whereas when we just try to optimize in a performance marketing way every channel, every pound spend, I think that produces bad outcomes for the users of the platforms and the buyers, as opposed to good outcomes.
Yeah, just kind of segueing into the AI point as well, I do think AI will have a huge impact on the advertising game, in how hard it is to stand out and how creative people need to be. And I think marketers will end up investing a lot more in creative and branding as a result of AI, because AI will be able to produce ads and creative and stuff that is kind of on a level playing field right now with the poor ads and maybe even the average ads. So us humans will need to start going above and beyond that to really stand out. So in the AI world, and how we think AI will impact B2B marketing in 2024, what are some thoughts on that?
Well, just on your point there, AI will, in one sense, I think AI will help a lot of people into and onto platforms that they might not have yet utilized, and it will make an awful lot of, shall we say, non-expert users of them average users, as good as average. But we know that AI can't go beyond that for the most part, and that's where the human element is required, and it might drive some of that. So I think you're going to see people coming into a space and onto a platform and achieving mediocre results and mediocre creativity and capability, but not better than that.
Yes, I suppose from my perspective, AI's impact, the way I sort of see it is that this year has been a lot about experimentation with AI. A lot of people have been testing out, seeing what does and doesn't work, trying out different platforms to figure out what they might be able to use. I think we're seeing a lot of normalization of how things are used. I think a lot of people, when it comes to the quality of what comes out of AI at the moment, obviously that's subject to change, is that it's better for research and for helping you get to a first draft than it is to, for creating something that actually sounds human and genuine. So in the content creation space, certainly that there's still limitations there, but it's still very powerful. It's just behind the scenes, or it should be, with the quality of what's produced at the moment. And then on the other side, I strongly suspect that people will use AI and find ways to use AI to allow them to filter out more of the things that they don't want to see. I don't think that people enter platforms wanting to see half the content that is shoved at them, and ultimately, I think that AI will be one of the solutions to stripping out the things that people can't report as offensive at the moment, but they still don't want to see it. So how can people carve out an environment that is full of stuff they deem to be high quality?
Yeah. I think the way I'd recommend marketers think about AI is don't think of it or hope it to be a solution for creativity that wins. It's not there yet. But we are all information workers, and the amount of information that we're expected to work with has only risen over years, to the point where actually it's pretty astonishing that we get anything done, given the amount of words that we're supposed to process and manage and store and recall and access and find, and and AI's power to help us interrogate, access, process that information is huge. I've really been blown away, frankly, by how good it is at doing that role for us. And I think that will make us as marketers more efficient, more impactful again, put us back in control maybe of our time and our days. And that's really valuable and worth embracing. And so I do say adopt AI now for those applications to get you back on top of that information pile and create some space in your mind for creativity and execution and analysis of real data that really matters. But don't turn to it and hope that it can create show-stopping social ads or a truly insightful, valuable article or pillar page, because it still really genuinely can't do that.
Yeah. Outside of the AI space, in terms of technology, do you see any other things emerging? It might be, just ideas. I know Amanda thinks that the next LinkedIn is going to come along. Drop.
I call it the LinkedIn killer. I don't know what it is yet, but genuinely, they've been so dominant in their space for so long, unchallenged. I cannot believe that there is no one out there working out something that is better right now. There's, enough good ideas in this world that something is coming along, and LinkedIn aren't making many changes to themselves, so they're not going to stay nimble. We've already seen challenges to some of the big channels, but there's nothing in the B2B space. So I think it's out there. I think it's waiting in the wings. I think next year is the year we'll start to hear about it for sure.
I hope that LinkedIn doesn't follow engagement and ad revenue optimization over a cliff edge. I hope that they respond and they make changes, because there's a lot of value. But I think we will see new things emerge. I'm pretty interested in what's going on with Mastodon and the decentralized social media movement. It's very early days, and it's likely not the solution that will gain massive traction and adoption. But nonetheless, it's a response and a reaction to the drawbacks of these large, almost monopolizing platforms that we have today. So that's very interesting. And I don't think I'm the only one here that thinks it, but I think as we see an enormous rise in AI-driven content of a variety of forms, we'll see an AI a rise in probably AI powered ways to weed it out. Much as you've just indicated, detecting AI content before it gets to our eyeballs, probably attractive some point down the road. We have ad blockers today that are in a constant battle with the platforms to function. But likelihood is we'll see AI blocking somewhere.
AI blockers.
Because people will not want to feel like they've been sort of duped, as it were, into believing that something AI generated is human generated. But it will become increasingly hard to tell, and the volume will be increasingly high. So we need something that does it on our behalf. So I reckon that's probably an area we'll see some development.
I think so too. I think that it will go a bit beyond AI to better tailoring of what's given to you to consume, because it's all very well, when something is genuinely offensive or contravenes guidelines, being able to report it. But there's plenty of stuff that comes up in almost every channel now that you wouldn't choose to engage with, but it's there, and you spend 2 seconds looking at it to understand what it is, and suddenly you're getting more of it, and you've got no way to opt out and curate what you actually see. I had a conversation with a friend recently who was saying, you can spend a very long time making sure that you're looking only at content that you genuinely like on TikTok, and you look at one thing for a second too long, and suddenly that's all you're getting. Channels can be ruined by that, and your experience can be ruined by that. So yeah, it seems to me inevitable that there will be some way to introduce more control.
Yeah, I hope so. I think we all hope so. Cool. So wrapping things up here, we were going to touch on a couple of things that we think, I suppose, individually and as a collective, will make a comeback in 2024. Those things that were dead and buried, that I suppose we think are making a bit of a resurgence. So Amanda, do you want to kick us off there?
Sure. I think it might be a bit of a wild card one. I still think fundamentally that there are plenty of people who read faster than they can listen. And so I do think that we could well see a kick back to the high value long form content, actually being something that people create more of and consume more of. It's all very well having, I am paying full attention to an event like this. Obviously, I'm in it, but people taking the time to listen to or watch a podcast like this, they can only digest the content as quickly as we can deliver it. People speed things up and so on, but your natural pace of understanding is defined by your reading speed, really. So I think it's inevitable that some people will find ways to go back to that. One of the things that I've genuinely thought for years now is I go to look at content on TED Talks and I end up stopping the video to read the transcript, because I know the quality of the content is in there and I can read faster than they can talk. So if I want to mainline that information, I'm going to do it that way. And I think plenty of people do want that. So I could see that making a real comeback.
Phil?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I don't know about things making a genuine comeback. Certainly not from the grave, as it were. I partly think that search will get a bump next year as we start to see a bit of a shake-up as marketers master social media, because search is a nice safe environment where you're not affronted by the content that you see. It's not a bombardment, and it's not a product of the moment that you choose to log in. It's a result that you generate by searching. So I think that there might be a little bit of a bump for search. And then when you add in the AI element, the fact that most search engines that we know today will incorporate some degree of AI chat as a mode of search, that's not necessarily a comeback, but more of an evolution, and that might produce a new wave of interest in search as a channel. And of course, what we've heard about being discovered in large language models so far sounds a lot like SEO. And so, I think people will continue to do SEO to be found in search results, whether they are search engine results pages or chat responses. And those chat responses are, I think, a way around some other, less controllable methods of discovering information. So we know that, when you ask chat an AI a question, you get an average answer, as in it tends to be the average of all answers. That's quite useful in some cases where all the individual answers are highly biased, highly opinionated, bought, paid for, and sold individual opinions. You can aggregate that and summarize it quite effectively with an AI response. So I think there's going to be interest in that area.
Yeah. I don't know if mine is a comeback necessarily, but something I definitely think will take more prominence. Like you said, Phil, I don't think it's coming back from the grave necessarily, but more of a lean towards correlation in marketing and kind of gut feeling, qualitative insights, and really moving away from performance-based marketing and that extreme level of measurement, and kind of back to a time where we look at trends, look at correlation between things we're doing and the bottom line, and get qualitative insights rather than getting hyper focused on tiny conversion rates here, there, and everywhere, A/B testing absolutely everything, kind of taking a more holistic step back at marketing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've been moving in that direction for some time. When you over-index on performance-based methods of marketing, you tend to make things worse for buyers rather than better. Platforms get worse, channels get worse, saturated, optimized, ruined. And yet we've seen that when you optimize for, the buyer truly and the pipeline that you need to generate, you often get better results. At Demand this year, Rand Fishkin gave an excellent talk on the changes that he's seeing in the effectiveness or lack of in attribution. And he talked about the concept of lift, where advertisers of old would put up an ad in the street and measure the lift in the sales at the local shops. It's not that dissimilar. We create the content we think or know buyers want and let them consume it freely in a way that we can't measure. And we see the lift in the pipeline. So I think he's 100% right about that. And I think that in some ways that is a comeback, and it's a comeback from quite some time ago, from when before performance-based marketing things were invented and existed. So yeah, that's a comeback.
Yeah,
cool.
I agree.
All right, well, let's wrap things up there then. And I suppose we'll have to come back to this in a year's time and see how our predictions played out, right?
True. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so see you in 12 months on this topic. Right, let's wrap it up there anyway, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Demand Decoded. Be sure to follow the Blend LinkedIn page to join any future events live, and you can catch all the episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Just search for Demand Decoded. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.